As most of you know, we've spent the last year since the last WRP meeting kind of wrapping up the old or original QZAP and reporting on what's been done in the last 10 years on QZAP. And so now we're just going to talk a little bit about updating those recommendations for the future for what we kind of coined QZAP 2.0 for the future. So I'll try to go through this timeline fairly quickly for time, but just kind of a history of significant milestones in the management of zebra and quagga mussels. As most of you know, they were discovered in the Great Lakes in the late 80s. And then, as Susan mentioned earlier today, in the 1990, the Non-Indigenous Aquatic Nuisance Prevention and Control Act was passed, which created the task force, the Western Regional Panel, and the Great Lakes Panel. In 1993, we had our first detection of mussels in Oklahoma, the most western detection. And then in 1997, we had the National Invasive Species Act was reauthorized, NAPSA, I don't know how you say that. In 2003, zebra mussels were found in El Dorado Reservoir in Kansas, so they're still marching further west. 2007 was when quagga mussels were found in Lake Mead. I'm sure most of you know, and alarm bells started going off. And so in 2008, many western states created their watercraft inspection and prevention programs to try and stop this invasion coming westward. And then in that year, QZAP was the Quagga Zebra Action Plan for Western Waters was requested by Senator Feinstein. So in 2010, that was published by the Western Regional Panel after getting task force approval. And then in 2011, WISCI was formed. That's the Western Invasive Species Coordination Effort, and that's just a pretty informal group of Western state coordinators getting together and talking on the phone regularly and talking through a lot of issues. 2012 was when we had the watercraft inspection and decontamination legal workshop. I'll get into some of this in a little more detail. 2013, the Building Consensus Committee under WRP started, or initiative. And then 2013, we found quagga mussels in Lake Powell. Big game changer for us there. As many of you know, and I know Nate talked about this yesterday, big deal for us. 2014, the Regional Watercraft Inspection and Decontamination Data Sharing System was launched. And again, I think you saw a presentation on that yesterday, this afternoon, sorry. I'm like, what day is it? That most states and multiple entities are using to share that information about watercraft moving around. Again, in 2014, WRDA was authorized for the Columbia River Basin to do WID. 2015 was when we began engaging National Marine and Manufacturers Association and the American Boating and Yachting Club, and they had their first Marine Summit on AIS, and that we were beginning our partnership with the industry to try and address this issue. 2017 was the National Wildfire Coordination Group Guide to Preventing Aquatic Invasive Species Transport by Wildland Fire was released. And then, as Hillary was giving us an update earlier today, in 2007 kicked off the DOI's Safeguarding the West initiative from invasive species. 2018, Western Governors Association, at the helm of Governor Ige of Hawaii, he launched the Biosecurity and Invasives Initiative. And then in 2018, the WRP completed the Building Consensus in the West work. Later that year, the ABYC Technical Information Report was released with help from the boating industry. 2018, WRDA was reauthorized for watercraft inspection and decontamination in the Columbia, but it also added the Upper Colorado, Upper Missouri, South Platte, and Arkansas River basins to get funding. So that was a pretty big deal for us here. 2019, so in April, we published the QZAP status update report and the Building Consensus final report. Again, I'll talk a little more detail about that. And so in 2020, looking forward, what do we want the next QZAP to look like? So what is the future of invasive mussel management in the West look like? It's our opportunity to decide what this looks like. Our first QZAP, you know, it was very new. We weren't quite sure what we were doing necessarily. I think we probably have a much better vision now and lessons learned of how to proceed in the future. So just thinking about this as a panel, what do you want this next iteration of QZAP to look like? What does the future of invasive mussel management look like to you or your organization? What does it look like in 5 years? What does it look like in 10, 20, 30 years? Where do we want to be? So please keep that in mind as I'm talking through that, and if we have any time for discussion later. What does successful, you know, mussel prevention and management look like? So the Quagga Zebra Action Plan for Western Waters, as I mentioned, was requested of the WRP in 2008. It was submitted for approval to the task force in 2009 and was approved in February of 2010. It was evaluated by the WRP in 2013 and extended by the task force in 2014. And really the goal is to summarize our current strategies. So we don't want to stop doing, you know, current and ongoing efforts, but also to identify and prioritize our future actions and what that looks like. And I know that in putting together the report on the last QZAP, at times there was a struggle finding kind of objective or measurable things to report on. So something to think about in the future is, can we have measurable objectives that we can look back on and say, we definitely achieved this, and so it's easier to see that progress, although I think we all know there's been a ton of progress in the last 10 years. So the highest priority goals of the initial QZAP was to increase capacity to address invasive mussels, implement mandatory inspection and decontamination at infested waters, continue development of effective watercraft inspection and decontamination protocols and standards, adopt standard watercraft and equipment inspection and decontamination protocols in the Western U.S., and to expand mandatory watercraft inspection and decontamination into uninfested regions. And these were the highest priority goals, but there were 37 action items in that original QZAP. So again, we published these final reports on building consensus and QZAP in April 2019. Those went out to the WRP listserv, so you should have all seen those and hopefully had a chance to look over those. So one of the things that became apparent with the initial QZAP to the Western Regional Panel in implementing some of these highest priorities is that there was a lack of consistent or uncertain legal authorities between and amongst states, definitely between state and federal agencies, and that was a big barrier to initiating and conducting mandatory watercraft inspection and decontamination programs. So and particularly with large interjurisdictional waters, you think Powell, Havasu, Meade, those are very complicated. They span multiple states. You have, in many cases, BOR is the entity that owns the infrastructure, and then, BLM or Park Service is the managing agency, or in my state, Pleasant, I've got a county managing. So there's, as we know, it can be a challenge. So as a result, we have all these products from Building Consensus, the model law and regulations that were released, model MOU, gap analysis, comparing all the state laws and regulations, and just very detailed to help identify if a certain state was lacking in particular authority, and just making that easier for states to adopt similar laws and regulations to have a more seamless programs across jurisdictions. So just to mention, this was a partnership with the National Sea Grant, Oregon Sea Grant, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, AFWA, and the Association of Assistant Attorney Generals all got together on this over many years, and I know there was a lot of long, tedious meetings to get there, but they're fabulous products. So anybody that's starting a a programmer looking to strengthen their programs can look to these very easily and hopefully adopt those. Also, the federal agencies release this federal policy options, and which is fantastic, talking about what kind of authorities federal agencies have for stopping invasive species coming into or out of their properties. And we're not necessarily 100% there yet, but it's been good progress. So the operational standards for the highest priorities of the initial QZAP produced all these products here now. The field standards for sampling and monitoring and early detection. We have standardized training modules and tiered trainings so that people know how to inspect a boat and decontaminate a boat the same way to minimum standards. So uniform minimum standards and protocols, the chemical addendum, recommendations on chemicals for treatment of invasive species on boats. Just many, many great things that have come out of this to address the initial QZAP. So when thinking about the future, we want to roll all these separate efforts and initiatives into the future QZAP so that there's one single comprehensive strategy and plan so that we can inform decisions in the future, again, for the next 10, 20, 30 years with a single voice. And I think we all recognize that much of the West is uninfested with dry-scented mussels, and we want to keep it that way. As state agencies and federal, we're charged with ensuring fantastic recreation opportunities and values, and there's a lot of resources worth protection and balancing those two things, which can be very difficult. But we know, and you can see on this map, watercraft inspection and decontamination programs work. You can see in that uninfested West, these are programs or states with programs that have been doing inspection and decontamination. But they work better when we're working together as a region from state to state and having, I think somebody mentioned some redundancy, right, Erin, maybe from earlier, that, prevention and containment go hand in hand. So all those blue dots are watercraft inspection and decontamination stations. And then that overlay is the WRDA 2018 authorization for all of those river basins. And so that money can be used in a pretty broad way to be able to protect the waters in those basins. And so that's a huge opportunity for us moving forward. So again, like I mentioned, for QZAP 2.0, we want to have as much as possible specific, measurable objectives. We already have broad support for, WRP and the data sharing system. We continue to need long-term sustainable funding for annual operations, coordinated education, in-reach messaging, prioritizing research and coordinating that. Regional strategic implementation, that one is definitely always a challenge, but I feel like we keep getting closer and closer and better at that over time. Expanding state-to-state collaborations, state and federal relationships and partners, and then increasing public and private partnerships. So the purpose of this, as I kind of already said, was to have a strategic regional set of measurable action items that we can inform our decisions moving forward. And so to compare, the 2010 with the 2020, there's really, you can see not much change. Like we have these ongoing priorities and initiatives that we still want to increase or definitely maintain capacity, funding and coordination. Small change for the 2020 is we added prevention and containment. We still need early detection monitoring and rapid response, managing existing populations, education and outreach. Another change, we took research and added that to control management and research for 2020 moving forward. So the timeline for this, some of you have already provided input, and Whiskey has met and talked about where their priorities might be, and will continue to meet. But there is a member call coming up on October 30th at 9 a.m., and so I highly encourage you all to call in and think about, like I said in that earlier slide, what does a successful QZAP 2.0 look like to you or your organization, and come with your recommendations and objectives, measurable objectives. So following that, Elizabeth and Dennis, I believe, will be at the November task force meeting and present the updated recommendations. In December, we'll continue editing and doing, receiving comments after that task force meeting. January, I believe Elizabeth will present that at OFWA. We can take that to NISA, National Invasive Species Awareness Week, when we make visits to Washington, D.C. And I'm sure we'll continue to edit those in the spring, and then we have our mid-year call in April. May, we have the other ANS task force. June, WGA will be presented the updated 2.0. July, we've got WAFWA and graphic design. August, SOBA. Oh my gosh, why am I blanking on that acronym? Boating access, folks. And then we'll put final touches on it. And we hope to have a finalized 2.0 in September. And then October, we have NASMA and again, the WRP meeting in Alaska. And so hopefully by next year, we have a wonderful new 2.0 updated strategies, not a new plan, updated strategies for the future. So I don't know if we have time for discussion or comments. Yeah, Blaine.
Erin, the time is 9 a.m. Is that Mountain Time, Central Time?
That is a good question, but I will make sure when that goes. We'll make sure when that goes out, it's on the appointment. It is clear. We'll make sure it's not like 7 a.m. on your time.
Right, Alaska time may be really early.
Just a couple comments. As Erin alluded to, we kind of touched on this a little bit at our whiskey meeting. And for those of you that don't know what whiskey is, Stephen says it's a secret society and we're a bunch of ninjas. But it's the Western Invasive Species Coordinating Effort, kind of an informal group of the states, and the entities are doing watercraft inspections and decontaminations. We did preview some of the goals and objectives of QZAP. We will send those out, the draft plan, to Whiskey and the rest of WRP to be able to provide those comments and have an informed discussion when we meet on the 30th.
And I don't know that I really stressed, we're looking at future priorities and recommendations, but there's also a lot of stuff that we are currently doing that is, we want to maintain being a priority. And so if you see some of those go out and you're like, wow, we're doing WID here at this location, or we're doing this and that, it's not that we're saying QZAP 2.0, like there's nothing being done, but it's our current and future priorities. And so even if there's good work already happening, we want that to continue and to remain a priority. And there's some definitely high priority water bodies and game changers that, infestations definitely change the way we manage in the West. So just keep that in mind. Any other questions or comments?
Outside of whiskey, will there be other opportunities for comment on the 2.0?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that member call is, for all WRP membership.
So mainly at the member calls?
I believe you can send comments to Elizabeth, like at any point. I think Alaska's already sent pretty comprehensive, I'm like looking for Tammy and can't find her, but I believe Alaska's already sent, pretty comprehensive comments to Elizabeth. So feel free to email those to Elizabeth if you have those and you want to get those submitted before. But yes, of course, it's open to all of the WRP membership. Okay, thank you.